So today we're going to talk about something I should be an expert on, the 1960s, because I was born in 1951. I'm not an expert on the 1950s because I was little, and I remember bits and pieces here and there. I remember Sputnik going over. Uh, these, I had vague recollections, but I was just a little kid. By 1960, I was 9. So I was starting to tune into the world around me and follow news a little bit in the 60s. And by 1969, I graduated from high school. The summer after I graduated, I remember I drove with my mother to a wedding in northern Ohio. And on the way back, we had the radio on listening to the first man on the moon get out and walk. One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. That was a big deal. And the whole rest of the 60s was a series of wonderful peace and love and flowers and good feelings and no problem whatsoever. It was the summer of love. I think that was 1968. No, that was 1967. So 1968 was a shit show. My apologies for my French. Oh no. Why should I? There was no fake news in 1969. Walter Cronkite, man, you could put it in the bank with him. And why would they fake all that? No, that's ridiculous. In my opinion, it's conspiracy theories. Now, there are some conspiracies, but you got to be careful about going too far with conspiracy theories. I don't think it was fake. I don't think 9/11 was fake. I don't think Pearl Harbor was faked. I don't believe any of that crap. Sorry, I just don't. Anyway, so 1960s. Let's see. So there's my little picture of the 1960s. And, of course, the big deal was John Kennedy. I showed you part of 13 Days, correct? That actor, I think, portrays Kennedy pretty well. I'm not too impressed with Kevin Costner's role in that movie, but the actor who played John Kennedy and the actor who played Robert Kennedy, I thought both of them did a very good job. And so the 1960s was significant because it was a change of generations. Eisenhower, and before him Truman, before them FDR, they were all from the World War I generation. Truman, I think, was either a sergeant or a lieutenant in World War I of an artillery battery. Eisenhower was in World War I, also World War II. So I don't know if they were part of the progressive generation, which included, I don't think they were. That would have included Teddy Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson. But a study I did once shows that presidents tend to come in clusters from strong generations, and strong generations tend to alternate. So you have a strong generation like the progressive generation, then you had the quiet generation. I think it was after the progressives, it was the Roaring Twenties. That was the what did they call them? I don't remember, but they were like, let's go out and party. And then you had the World War II, the greatest generation, and that was another strong generation. Then after them came the quiet generation. My uncle and I think my dad were from the quiet generation. No one was ever elected president from the quiet generation. John McCain ran and lost. He was from the quiet generation. The guy in the 1996 ran against Bill Clinton. I can't remember his name, but he ran and lost. So you had a bunch of presidents from the progressive generation, and then it goes all the way up to Eisenhower. Eisenhower was president for 8 years in the 1950s. I think he was a pretty good president, in my opinion, except for 2 or 3 things he did with the CIA, which pissed me off. But other than that, he was pretty good. And then you get a new generation. John Kennedy was from the greatest generation of World War II. He served as a PT boat captain, injured his back. His boat was shot up or wrecked, and he had to swim from one island to another to try to get help for his men who were marooned on the first island. I don't remember how many miles it was, but he had to swim a ways to get to the other island and get help. So he was a bit of a World War II hero. And after Kennedy, then comes, of course, Johnson and Nixon and Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter. And after Jimmy Carter comes uh, Ronald Reagan, I think, if I'm not mistaken. Correct me if I'm wrong. And then George H.W. Bush. All of them. I didn't count those. I was like 7 or 8. All of them were from the same generation, the greatest generation of World War II, the civic generation, the John Wayne generation, the Jimmy Stewart generation. And there's reasons why they're called the greatest generation. They went out and saved the world, basically, from fascism and eventually from communism. So John Kennedy was a fresh new face. He was the youngest person elected president up to that point, and he represented a brand new generation. Think of it this way. My generation is the baby boomer generation, and the first guy elected from my generation was Bill Clinton in 1993, I think, or 4. Then after Bill Clinton comes George W. Bush, son of George H.W. Bush, and then comes Barack Obama, and then comes Donald Trump, all of them from the baby boomer generation. So you skip over the quiet generation, you go to another strong generation of baby boomers. I know many of you are tired of baby boomers, and I'm with you on that. I'm kind of tired of them too. And I'm not a baby boomer defender. I'm more of a Gen Z defender and millennial, because I believe in you guys. I think you're going to go out and save the world too. Yeah, and you're thinking, yeah, right. Go ahead. Oh, there you are. Where you been? I called your name. Hi, Danny. I've missed you. You want a hug? No, that's not a hug. Go ahead.
Would you rather have like a Gen X president?
Well, we haven't had a Gen X president, although, and Ron DeSantis was Gen X, and he didn't make it. So Gen X is another kind of quiet generation, a little bit cynical, after the baby boomer and before the millennials. So it's another one of those generations that are stuck between two strong generations. And the pattern of history going back to the founding of the country is that you don't get any presidents from those passive generations. I'm not saying everybody in the generation is passive, but there's certain historical circumstances that create strong generations. And there's never been a baby boomer president. If Nikki Haley had been nominated and ran, she might have been the first. I'm sorry, I said baby boomer. I meant Gen X. If she had been nominated and had run as a Republican candidate, she might have been a Gen X president, but she didn't get the nomination. So think of it this way. What if, through some unusual combination of events, with these two old men running against each other in this election coming up in November, what if somebody came out of nowhere who was 38 and ran as an independent? I'm just saying, Kennedy was not an independent, but now it's too late. Both of the old parties have it locked up for their old guys. What if a guy came out of nowhere and ran as an independent at 38 years old and was elected, promising reform, social programs, someone really tuned in to the issues of our day, AI, and all these things? You probably would get excited about that, right? I probably would get excited about it, to be honest. This is what happened with John Kennedy, although he wasn't an independent. But, you've had all these World War I guys that have been presidents, and Eisenhower, let's face it, as much as I like him, he's a little boring. He did a lot behind the scenes. He didn't like to draw a lot of attention to himself, so he was kind of like the hidden hand president. But boring, and people got tired of Harry Truman. And then along comes this young guy out of Boston, first Catholic ever to win the presidency, full of idealism. Of course, he had his character flaws, as many great men and women do. But he was represented a lot of idealism, as you kind of saw in the portion of the film you saw from 13 Days, a fresh face. And so the the country kind of nicknamed his presidency Camelot. You know the story of Camelot? Who is Camelot about? King Arthur. And King Arthur was a king who wanted to do nobly. He wanted to institute a reign of justice and equality and peace in England, and bring shalom, or bring peace to England as a righteous ruler or just ruler. And so he's mythic. I mean, he probably never really existed. No one knows for sure if he existed historically. But Camelot represents his rule, a rule of justice, peace, equity, opportunity, fairness. And so they nicknamed the Kennedy administration Camelot, because he brought a lot of idealistic people from a new generation into office with him, and started out trying to do things a little bit differently, and then 3 years later was assassinated. And I think it was November 1963, and it pretty much brought Camelot crashing down. And LBJ, Lyndon Johnson, became the president, a very different kind of leader, very progressive and liberal in his own way, but not the kind of person that would inspire that kind of idealism. So this was the beginning of the 1960s, a big upsurge of idealism, hope and change. Remember that? What am I referring to with hope and change? Danica's like, don't look at me. But you're smiling, that's good. Hope and change. I mean, you guys have been around long enough to remember this. 2008, you were alive in 2008, right? Yeah. Obama, that was his motto. It was a good motto. Hope and change. There's been worse mottos. I'm not going to go into them because I'll offend somebody. But hope and change is a good motto. So is Make America Great Again. Actually, if you think about it, it's not a bad motto. It's how you define it that becomes the problem. Is it for everybody or just certain people? And so hope and change was the Obama motto in 2008. And he was also that kind of leader, like an inspirational leader, a good speaker, represented something brand new, not a new generation, but the first time a black man had been elected president of the United States. So that brought a rush of enthusiasm and positivity. Unfortunately, these kinds of events, presidencies, probably almost always doomed to failure, because you can never live up to the expectations. And Obama certainly didn't live up to some of his expectations, and many leftists were very disappointed in his administration, as were many conservatives. And Kennedy had the blessing that he didn't live long enough to disappoint people terribly. I mean, he disappointed Cubans in Miami, but that was partly the CIA's fault, the whole Bay of Pigs thing. And so Kennedy died kind of like a martyr to this idealism, and so Camelot remained this ideal, and it didn't live long enough to get mired in corruption or scandal or disappointment or failure. That's the beginning of the 1960s, and that kind of sets the stage. And so this is a 7-year period, basically. He ran against Richard Nixon, who was a Cold War warrior. Actually, Kennedy was too. But Nixon had built his reputation on hunting down and ferreting out communists and harassing them out of office. That was kind of Nixon's thing. We'll come back to Nixon later when he becomes president in 1968. Hey, Laura. But so in this 7-year period was a burst of idealism. And even after Kennedy was gone, Johnson pursued the Great Society, which was an attempt to reduce poverty. He also enacted the Voting Rights Act in 1965, which probably tripled the number of black voters that could vote, and we'll talk about that. Johnson actually did a lot of good things. He maybe did more than Kennedy did, partly off of Kennedy's, the goodwill left after Kennedy's death. That gave Johnson some freedom to act. But by 1968, John Kennedy was dead. Robert Kennedy was dead. Martin Luther King Jr. was dead. All of them assassinated. Malcolm X was dead. Medgar Evers is dead. On and on and on. A bunch of people were killed and assassinated. It was a tumultuous period of time. And by 1968, the dream of Camelot was dead. That's called a dramatic pause. Just to allow you to think for a moment. So you have a whole country that has this moment of aspiration and hope, and about 8 years later, it's crushed. And I remember very well 1968 in Chicago at the Democratic National Convention with a police riot. The police were rioting against young people that were there to protest the Vietnam War. And I don't have time to play you some documentary. There's a good film about it, but we don't have time to do that. But if you're interested, I encourage you to look into it because that was a watershed. And if you think it's bad now, which it is bad now. It's maybe not quite as bad as 1968 yet. So when my young nephew gets discouraged, I say, I lived through 1968. It can get worse, believe me. So John Kennedy, in one of his aspirational speeches, I think it was his first inauguration, said, "Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country." This was the kind of spirit or ethos of the 1960s, was a spirit of sacrifice, a spirit of service, willingness to forego your own benefit and to work for the good of the country, the good of the world. So in this period of time, we had reform of civil rights. We had Medicare enacted. We had the War on Poverty by Lyndon Johnson. That was after Kennedy was gone. The young idealists who believed in Kennedy now detested Kennedy's liberalism. That was after 1968. I was one of those. I was, I was a Democrat. My father was a Union Democrat. I guess you would call kind of like a blue dog or conservative Democrat. There used to be conservatives in the Democratic Party and liberals in the Republican Party. That doesn't quite exist anymore. Everything's become so polarized. But because my dad was a Democrat, I was a Democrat, and then the Vietnam War came along, and I got involved in the anti-Vietnam War protests. There was a senator from Wisconsin named Eugene McCarthy who was running against Johnson in 1964 for the nomination. This was after Kennedy was killed. He was running on a platform of ending the war. He wanted the Vietnam War stopped. 1964. I hope we'll have time. We may not be able to do it till Thursday. Talk about the Vietnam War. So I was a McCarthyite. I was in favor of this Eugene McCarthy, the senator. A lot of young people got involved in supporting his campaign. It's kind of like Bernie Sanders in 2016. A lot of young people got behind him. There's kind of an anti-war movement growing right now. I don't know how big it's going to get, but there's a lot of people protesting what's going on in Gaza. Whatever your feelings are, it's always tragic when you see the loss of life, especially women and children. So I'm not going to comment on that, but there is a anti-war movement growing. So Kennedy promised a new frontier in the area of civil rights. He wanted to improve the relationship of the United States with Latin America. He proposed a alliance for progress. This is partly in response to the Cuban Revolution. He basically said, if we don't want to have communist revolutions in the Western Hemisphere, in the Americas, we need to deal with the root causes of what might contribute to that. In other words, poverty and authoritarianism. And so the Alliance of Progress was a idea that he had to do something for Latin America similar to what the United States did for Germany and Italy and Japan after World War II, which was the Marshall Plan, investing billions of dollars into our defeated enemies to try to help them recover. A novel idea. If they had done that after World War I, there probably wouldn't have been a World War II. So Kennedy's brilliant idea was, we don't want any more Cubas. So what's the best way to do that? Let's not go to military force first. Let's try investing money in a partnership and helping these countries develop their industries and education and infrastructure. That was Kennedy's brainchild. And I think it would have made a difference. The problem was he died. And Lyndon Johnson didn't have a vision for continuing that program. And Vietnam War took off and sucked all the money away from trying to help Latin America into fighting in Vietnam. Also in the New Frontier, he said, we're going to put a man on the moon in 10 years, in this decade. And I think he did that in 1961. And in 1969, I think a man landed on the moon. Anthony thinks probably it was done at NBC Studios. I'm kidding you. Okay. Charisma, style, and personality are more important than platforms. This is the new politics. So before this time, platforms were important. But one of the reasons why Kennedy got elected by a paper-thin margin against Nixon was that they were on TV. It was the first publicly televised TV debate in history, and Nixon forgot to shave. So he had, now it's very stylish and a little bit sexy, or at least maybe not for you guys, but maybe else, to have like a, 1 week growth stubble or beard. Oh, you have one. Yeah, I think it looks good. Probably sexy. I'll let others be the judge of that. Yes.
What was the channel called back then?
There was ABC, CBS, and NBC were the 3 channels. That was all there was. And you got better quality content on 3 channels than I can get on 300 right now. What are you going to do? Anyway, so they have advertised this debate. Nixon didn't. Nowadays they know you got to shave, you got to use makeup, you got to get the lighting right. They didn't know that then. And most people who listened to him on the radio said that Nixon won the debate. But if you watched him on TV, you thought that Kennedy won the debate because Kennedy looked better. So this is where it said charisma, style, and personality were more important than platforms and issues in the new politics. Do I want to comment further on that? See ya. No, I don't think I will. I mean, you can all think, make your own conclusions about current politics and how much do you know about the platforms, the policies. That's not what is usually featured on the main cable channels. They talk about personality. It's all about the personality. Kennedy was comfortable with media and the new politics. And so I already talked about this. Television and Chicago with Mayor Daley, who was a little corrupt. He ran Chicago. He got out some extra votes. Who no one knows exactly where he got them from. But the election was decided by 120,000 votes, which is not many. That's a very small margin in a nationwide election. Latinos also were very involved. You remember seeing from the new Latinos that the guy in Texas, whose name I can't remember, can't remember his name, but the doctor, he helped mount this campaign, this it's called something or other, Kennedy, Viva Kennedy campaign. And for the first time, the Latino vote was huge in elections, and they voted overwhelmingly for Kennedy. So here's a picture of Kennedy. He had magnetism, he had charisma. Most politicians usually have to have a little bit of that in order to get elected. Sometimes they don't. Robert Kennedy, that was Richard McNamara. He was the former head of the Ford Motor Company, and he became the Secretary of Defense. By the time I came along and started voting in 1968, he was a bad guy in our eyes because he was the Secretary of Defense during the Vietnam War buildup, which we'll talk about. But in the movie 13 Days, you see him as a little more appealing figure. Robert Kennedy became a trusted advisor to John Kennedy, and he was the Attorney General. He's also has the claim of fame of being the father to one of our current candidates. You know who that is? RFK Jr. is tried to run in the primaries as a Democrat, and he stacked against him, so he pulled out and is running now as an independent. He's, I think, in his early 60s. I might be wrong. He might be 70, but he's definitely younger than the other two. So during this time, you also had wars of liberation. That is, the Communist Party was encouraging uprisings and wars of liberation in parts of Africa and Latin America. And one of those was in Cuba, although it happened without any assistance from the Soviet Union. It was an indigenous uprising. Fidel Castro may or may not have been a communist when he undertook the goal of overthrowing Batista. He may have just been a nationalist. Whatever the case was, a few years later, he definitely was. He aligned himself with the Soviet Union, partly out of self-protection, probably, because he knew that there's a good chance that Cuba would be invaded, which it was. I just talked about this in my other class about the CIA engineered coup in Guatemala in we discussed this, right? 1953 or 4 maybe. Che Guevara was actually in Guatemala when that happened, and he left Guatemala after this CIA coup, which killed a democratically elected reform, and went to Mexico City where he met Fidel Castro and Raul. And they were talking about all these ideas about reform and land distribution and literacy. And he said, you guys have to make a decision. You either got to go strong or go home, because if you try to do some halfway reformism, the United States will never allow it. They'll invade you. And it was true advice. I'm not enough of a historian to tell what significance that advice had in the long run. But as it turned out, Fidel Castro aligned himself closely with the Soviet Union in order to have the protection of the Soviet Union. And in 1961, a force of 1,400 Cuban mercenaries, mostly from here in Miami, might have been some of your fathers and grandfathers, probably grandfathers, maybe even great grandfathers. I don't know. You guys are pretty young. So they invaded in the Bay of Pigs and were completely defeated. The CIA had a tremendous success, entre comillas, in Guatemala, in overthrowing Guatemala, despite the fact that the popular will of the people were opposed to it. But in Cuba, they could badly misjudged the support for Castro, and it was the overwhelming support of people, the Cuban people who came out to defend their revolution. And the Bay of Pigs badly failed, which looked bad on Kennedy. He was the new president as of January 1961. This is April, but the plan had been drawn up and developed under Eisenhower with the CIA, and Kennedy had reluctantly signed off on it. At the last minute, he decided not to use U.S. Air Force or CIA pilots flying American aircraft to support the invasion, and Cuban exiles have blamed Kennedy to this day for the failure of that invasion, which is why they almost all became Republicans. That's changing now because of generational change. Any questions? Am I talking too much? We're up to almost 30 minutes. We already talked about the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? This is linked in your in the module for this week, if you want to look at it. The Kennedy administration, interestingly enough, a lot of people blame Ronald Reagan, and rightly so, for the trickle-down economics, which his eventual running mate, George H.W. Bush, called voodoo economics before they were running mates. But actually, it was John Kennedy and his advisors who came up with the idea of sharp tax cuts especially for the wealthy, in order to get them to invest in the economy and get more money flowing to stimulate the economy. So this actually goes back to Kennedy, this trickle-down economics idea. And there was a strong civil rights movement going on. One of the key moments was in Birmingham in 1963. There was freedom rides in 1961. There was in 1963 in April, there were thousands of black marchers picketing department stores in Birmingham. Police used dogs, electric cattle prods, and high-pressure fire hoses to break up the crowds. But they were not really keyed into the fact that there was news media there recording and filming them beating people and turning dogs loose on them. That always, when you get film of that and it gets put on the national news, that makes an impact. And so the whole nation saw this going on in Birmingham, and it kind of roused people that were kind of ignorant of what the African Americans had to endure in Alabama and other southern states. Kennedy saw it, was outraged. He denounced racism on television the same night that Medgar Evers, who was a civil rights worker, was assassinated. There's a picture of Medgar Evers, and he was a World War II military veteran. Malcolm X. The next opportunity you have for extra credit is Malcolm X with Denzel Washington, one of my all-time favorite movies. I hope you'll watch it. This is the actual Malcolm X. Denzel Washington does such a good job. You watch some clips of the real Malcolm X, and then you watch the same clip from Denzel Washington, you think they're the same person. He was a Muslim minister and human rights activist. He was a courageous advocate for the rights of African Americans. He criticized white America intensively in the harshest terms for its crimes against black Americans. If you watch the movie about his life, what happened to his dad, what happened to his mom, his brothers and sisters, you will have sympathy for his passionate anger. It opened my eyes to a lot of things when I saw that film. Spike Lee is the director. And this brings us up to Black Power, and I think I'm kind of out of time. Let's see what I didn't get to go over. Huey Newton and Bobby Seale in 1966 formed a Black Panther Party in Oakland, California. They came up with the idea of Black Power, Malcolm X, and these others. This is a very different approach to civil rights than Martin Luther King Jr., which was more Christian, more Protestant, and more peaceful. Although there's more I could say. There's a picture there of Malcolm X with Dr. King. After Malcolm X took a Hajj, the journey to Mecca, to worship at Mecca, he in his journal he wrote that he sat down to eat in the Arabic way of eating with your left hand out of a bowl, common bowl, and he was eating with a blonde, blue-eyed, white Muslim from Serbia, not Serbia, but Bosnia maybe, or Kosovo. And he realized that his deep resentment against all whites was wrong. Although white people had hurt him and hurt his family, he realized he couldn't blame an entire race for that. And he came back changed and decided to abandon black supremacy or anti-white ideology, and went to see Dr. King and said, let's work together. Whereas before he criticized King. But within a few months he was assassinated by the Nation of Islam, probably. I don't know if there's proof. Martin Luther King gave a speech, I think it was in 1963, on the March on Washington, where he says, I have a dream. I may not get to go into the promised land. I may see it from afar, but I have this dream of people living together in equality and peacefulness and justice. And of course, in 1968, he was assassinated. And this is bringing us up to the Cold War and the Vietnam War. So I think I'll stop here. Does anybody have any questions about it? Okay, let me see. Oh, I gotta save this first. Give me a second. Okay, there's a bunch of you. Okay, give me a second. This is in the way. How do I do this? Sorry.